What's the most fascinating tidbit of psychology? Story 1, the idea that the leader isn't the most important person in a movement. The first follower is we want to fit in, and even if we agree with someone or want to do what they're doing, unless someone else is doing it with them, the leader is just a weirdo, and we feel like weirdos too for joining in. The first person to stand up with the visionary actually drives the movement. Story 2, my favorite, is the frequency illusion, which is basically noticing something occurring or appearing more often than before you had known about it. An example being learning about a new word, and suddenly it's everywhere you look. Story 3, bystander effect. The more people you're surrounded with, the least likely you're going to get help if you're in an emergency. Everyone thinks everyone else is going to get you help. Story 4, if you ask someone which they prefer of two options of ways to do something, they're significantly less likely to tell you they don't want to do it all. Example, would you prefer to clean the bathroom now or in a couple hours? Story 5, the Lake Wobegon effect. Human tendency is to describe oneself as above average in any number of traits, looks, driving abilities, etc. Of course, statistically we cannot all be above average, but when polled, more than half a population will respond that they are above average. The psychologist who coined the term was referring to a fictional town, Lake Wobegon, where everyone is attractive and excellent. Story 6, when you're standing on a very high ledge or balcony and you think of jumping, it doesn't mean you're suicidal. It's your brain subconsciously saying, hey, if you fall, you'll get hurt, so you'd better be extra careful. It's sort of like if you're holding a baby and the thought of dropping the baby crosses your mind. It doesn't mean you're a monster that wants to hurt that baby. It's your brain alerting you to the fact that that baby is very delicate and could be seriously hurt if it were to fall from your arms. So you'd better be extra careful not to let the baby fall. These thoughts are normal, and you shouldn't have to worry much unless they're distressing, they occur excessively, or there is a serious desire intent behind them. Story 7, this is a psychological life hack I learned a while ago about body language in an office environment. Pay attention to people's feet. If you approach two people in the middle of a conversation and they only turn their torsos and not their feet, they don't want you to join in the conversation. Similarly, if you are in a conversation with a coworker who you think is paying attention to you and their torso is turned towards you, but their feet are facing in another direction, they want the conversation to end. Story 8, if you go to Dunkin' Donuts late at night, chances are they will hook you up. I went to one at 11 p.m. for a donut and gave me 4 for the price of one. In some cases, they let you take all the donuts on display. Story 9, as a therapist, I read all the comments, felt my blood pressure rise, and nope, the out of this thread. Why I get so annoyed with pseudo bullshit. Edit, when I came into this thread, there were like 30 comments total, disregard. Story 10, no matter what your therapist's theoretical orientation, do they challenge everything you say, or do they give you nothing but support, or change behaviors instead of belief, or change beliefs instead of behaviors, etc., you're likely to get better. Story 11, spontaneous trait transference. People attribute traits you talk about others having as traits you yourself have. So when you call someone else slow, you yourself are more likely to be perceived as slow. Likewise, you call someone pretty, you're in turn more likely to be considered pretty. Story 12, men take breakups harder than women. It's fact, please don't downvote me, girls. It's just a general percentage. Wasn't expecting this to blow up, but hey, racist source. Story 13, projective identification. One of Freud's defense mechanisms. It's when someone makes a claim about you which they're actually feeling, then they instigate a response out of you to support they were right. For example, someone says you're upset. They rile you up to the point where you become upset. Then that person says, see, you're upset. Most of Freud's defense mechanisms are spot on, including projection, sublimation, displacement, denial, repression, regression, reaction formation, etc. Fascinating stuff. Story 14, every time you see someone smile, a set of neurons in your brain called mirror neurons fire off that are associated with making you smile yourself. But they are firing everything except for the motor neurons which turn the intention of smiling into the act of smiling. Basically, every time you see someone smile, your brain thinks you're smiling. Edit words. Story 15, cognitive dissonance. When a person confronts something that contradicts their internal beliefs, there's dissonance. That person must then close that dissonance using a number of different ways. If there is insufficient reward for holding that belief, that person latches onto it even tighter when experiencing dissonance. I hope I remembered it correctly. Story 16, that when a person is consciously hiding feelings or emotions, they express what they're trying to hide with involuntary micro-expressions that last only 1/115 of a second. and that can be caught with a high-speed camera. It's one of the pillars of the work of psychologist Paul Ekman, who inspired the authors of the TV series Lie to Me. Story 17, The Gregarious Instinct. I remember reading about it in a psychology book, perhaps by William James McDougall. All humans have this instinct, though it's astounding how few of us realize that. For example, the moment you hear the fearful scream of another human, you will feel that fear yourself for a short period of time. There is also the clearing of mental blockage that you feel the moment you share your things by talking to someone, which gives another testament to this instinct. Edit found an introduction to social psychology by William McDougall, DSc, FRS. Story 18, that when you walk through a doorway, your brain takes that as a cue to basically refresh your memory and compartmentalize it, which is why you generally forget when you walk into another room. Story 19, Johns Hopkins won't perform. Change operations as they classify being transgender as a mental disorder. Edit John. Johns and transgender to the correct form. Transgender. Story 20, change blindness. When a visual stimulus changes and we fail to notice it, it seems really obvious in a spectator's point of view. I can't find a video my teacher showed me, but Hey Race 1 and Hey Race another one from Running Man. The videos are kind of long though, lol. I think the placebo effect is pretty cool too. Just thinking you'll get better because you get a treatment, but it's a fake treatment, still gets you better sometimes. Story 21, I find Gottman's research on relationships really fascinating. He has a lab where he brings couples in and watches them fight, then can predict whether they will divorce at I think something like a 90 accuracy rate. What I took away most is this: people always say that communication in a relationship is so important. What is actually important is that you have compatible similar communication patterns. He also has a hypothesis on relationship killers called the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. Man, I wish I wasn't on mobile, would link, and also would read articles. Edit. Here's some links. Gottman's website from his blog, How to Improve a Relationship. Pop Psych article, 1998 journal article, 1989 journal article dash. Story 22, mental health counselor here. If I have a client hearing voices, I ask them if they're coming from inside their head or outside, as though someone is talking to you. Inside is more symptomatic of dissociative type disorders. Outside is more symptomatic of schizophrenic type disorders. Also, an individual with dissociative identity disorder, formerly multiple personality disorder, can have alters personalities that actually also have their own alters personalities. Story 23, after 4 years of college, 3 years of grad school, and nearly a decade of experience so far, I've learned that people need to actually show up to their therapy appointments if they want me to help them. Story 24, the most lethal mental disorder, by a very fair margin, is anorexia nervosa. Well, I work the field, so I have quite a few tidbits that are interesting. This one was first to pop to mind right now. Story 25, pseudocyesis, or false pregnancy. When a person believes they are pregnant when they aren't, they can have morning sickness, actually grow a baby bump, feel a fetus move inside them, and lactate. This can happen to both women and men. Fake it till you make it, I guess. Edit a word. Story 26, I read this somewhere. Next time people around you laugh in a group, look at who their eyes are immediately drawn to. It often indicates who they feel closest to. Not sure the accuracy of this, but definitely interesting to observe. Story 27, that narcissism is often triggered by a traumatic event in someone's past, and that they usually suffer from arrested development, keeping them in the same mindset as the age that the trauma happened. Story 28, you're most likely to place the cause of someone's mean or unpleasant behavior on their disposition rather than their situation, when in fact it is largely the opposite that is true. Story 29, look into Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. The TLDR of the experiment is that a bunch of perfectly normal and healthy college students were paid to act as cops and prisoners randomly chosen, which was a cop and which was a prisoner. The cops very quickly began to act sadistic and cruel with absolutely no prompting, even going so far as to beat and humiliate the prisoners. Zimbardo himself even got sucked into the experiment, only stopping it when his girlfriend realized how unethical it was. It basically helps explain why police brutality is so common. There's no bad apples. It's simply human to become abusive when put into a position of power like that. Story 30, agent detection. As an evolutionary rule of thumb, it is far better to detect a predator that isn't really there than it is to fail to detect a predator that really is there. Hear a little bump in the night. Your brain will automatically assume that something is there and it's coming to get you. This is why people think ghosts are in their house. Story 31, triple bluffs, whereby you make a request sounds so much like a double bluff that the person catches onto it and does the opposite, which is what you want them to do, without realizing the extended bluff you're doing. Story 32, Mormons have an odd attraction to trampolines. The weird part is this isn't a joke. Go ask one. They have, broke, or can't fit a trampoline in their backyard. Story 33. Humans are irrational decision makers. They avoid risk and are heavily subject to bias. The work of Kahneman and Tversky blew the top off of humans as rational. They won the Nobel Prize in economics for their work. They're not a Nobel in psych, FYI. Instead, we exist in bounded rationality and rely heavily on heuristics and shortcuts versus logical weighting of all possibly decisions. Story 34. The facial feedback hypothesis. The general concept is that we don't smile because we're happy, but we're happy because we smile. It leads to a whole mess of follow-up questions, and I'm not sure what the current state of it is, but it's a fascinating concept. Story 35. In psychology class, I learned about British cab drivers who had to know every single street in London to be a cab driver, and at the end of their training, when they memorized exactly where every street was, researchers found that their hippocampus, I think, was bigger than the average human's hippocampus. Story 36. Mine is a little boring, but as a psych math nerd, I find it pretty cool. I don't remember the scientific term for it, but basically when we look at a group of objects, we have different ways of determining how many objects are there. For example, if you look at a group of 3 apples, your brain just instantly recognizes that there are 3 of them without having to count them, because it knows what a group of 3 objects looks like. On the other hand, if you look at a group of 7 apples, your brain will either count them unlikely for such a low number or recognize that there's a group of 3 combined with a group of 4, quickly add them together, and realize that it's a group of 7 for large numbers. Counting is usually required. If I remember correctly, 4 is the general limit to how big the immediately recognizable groups can be, though we can occasionally recognize groups of 5 as well, generally depending on the orientation, I think. Again, I'm going off memory from something I read months ago, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Story 37. This is my own thought. No doubt others have made the same observation, and there's some official name for it. I call it the "I wash most of the dishes" fallacy to illustrate the apartment is shared by several roommates, and there isn't a schedule for who washes the dishes when all dishwashing is done voluntarily. Let's say they're all guys, so I can avoid dealing with Husha in this post. If you ask, each of the roommates will tell you that he washes more dishes than the others. If you ask each of them what percent of the dishes they wash, the percentages will add up to 150 or more. The reason is simple. When roommate A is washing dishes, he sees that he is washing dishes, but he is often absent when roommates B and C are washing dishes, so the evidence that occupies his brain is that he's the main dishwasher. There is evidence that the other roommates are washing dishes, ESP. Roommate A will come home and see that the dishes have been washed. A 1-second glance at an empty sink is less memorable, though, or has less impact on the brain's perception of reality than the 30 minutes that roommate A spent washing up the night before. This phenomenon applies to a lot more than household chores. It happens wherever actors physically see themselves doing anything and do not see the activity of others. I fap more than my roommates. Story 38. Acquiring negative biases about the world plus having a negative attributional style and anti-self-serving bias promotes rumination and the intensification of depressive symptoms. Negative attributional style is like saying bad things are because of my personal faults and good things are by chance or external factors. Story 39. Fundamental attribution error. When you perceive other people's actions as who they are rather than circumstantial, you make a mistake because you're tired, distracted, misunderstood what was asked, etc. Someone else makes the same mistake. While they're stupid or clumsy, also implicit association. As soon as you look at another person, place, or object, your brain makes instantaneous subconscious judgments about them based on stereotypes. Harvard has a series of tests on various associations you can take online. Story 40. I learned in high school that people can normally only recall 7 items at a time. To try and prove this wrong, I memorized a 28-character random generated key to my parents' Wi-Fi, but when I recited it back as I entered it, I was recalling the passphrase in groups of 3 to 5 characters at a time, with a total of 7 groups. Story 41. That the idea of we have been conditioned that say a plate is yellow, but we will never know if the color yellow I see and the color yellow you see is the same, but both of us have been conditioned to see this plate as yellow. Story 42. I've read the book, When Rabbit Howls, about Trudy Chase, who had over 100 different personalities. She was extremely abused at a very young age, which caused these personalities to be born. It explains in the book that when a young child is abused, their mind can't handle the trauma by itself, so it creates new and different personalities to handle the load of it all. There wasn't one personality that remembered all the abuse. They all only remembered bits and pieces. Her psychiatrist had to write everything down and piece it together after years and years of therapy and talking to her troops. That is what he called all of the personalities as a whole. All her personalities were different. Some were men, some were women, some were children, some were gentle and nice, some were violent and mean, etc. As her personality would change, her mannerisms would change, her voice would change, even her handwriting would change drastically. It's a sad story, but it's very interesting and a good book to read for anyone who is interested in psychology. Edit, I spelled her name wrong. It's Trudy, not Trudy. Story 43, each year, on average, feels shorter than the last because we go through fewer new experiences, and each year makes up a smaller fraction of one's life. 1 year to 1 year old is 100 of your life and experiences, while for a 2-year-old it becomes 50, a 3-year-old 33, etc. This is why many older people in their 70s to 80s think of their early mid-20s as the middle of their life rather than their 30s and 40s. Story 44, I am fascinated by the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I suffer from insomnia. I know sleep is one of the pillars of good health and go out of my way to make sure I get enough. If I have to get up early the next day, I often lie in bed stressed. I won't be able to fall asleep. The chance I might not be able to sleep keeps me up half the night. We obsess over what we fear to the point that we make it come true. If this is so, and it is, it stands to reason that the reverse is also true, you can make space for what you want to create. Story 45, Oedipus Complex. The part where you look at the women you're attracted to if you're a guy and realize they all kind of somewhat look like your mom. It checks out for me. What about you guys? Also, my friend once posted a TBT of her dad from when he was a high school senior in the 1950s or 1960s. He looked 100 like her current boyfriend at the time, who I'm close friends with, and he confirms the resemblance. Crazy. Story 46, Jung coined the terms introvert and extrovert. Jung believed that there are two main attitudes that people use to approach the world, which he called introvert and extrovert. People aren't either an introvert or an extrovert. All of us are usually a mix of both, but one type is more dominant than the other. Story 47, that it's possible to implant fake memories into people's minds. There is an experiment where AI Think German research group managed to convince 20 years old that they had committed a minor felony in their youth. The probans believed them and started to remember the incident, basically making stuff up, so it fit to the story they've been told. Very interesting, just compare it with stuff like making a murderer. Story 48, the replication crisis. This isn't actually psychology, but more about psychological research. It's come out recently that a large percentage of psychological studies, even those in high-impact journals, cannot be reliably replicated. Replication is one of the cornerstones of experimentation, and the fact that many of these studies can't be replicated cast doubt on their conclusions. Story 49, according to Amy Cuddy. Changing your posture can change your mindset, and your mindset can change your behavior. So say, sit in a submissive way for just a couple minutes, and inexplicably, you're not as likely to make assertive decisions. Now change to a powerful stance, and a couple minutes later with no prompting, you feel like you're in charge, assertive, and comfortable with making high-power decisions. Even when they're a gamble, helps in interviews. Story 50, for decades, I refused eye movement desensitization, reprogramming, EMDR therapy for post-traumatic stress. I believed the skeptical comments about it. Now I have read some research about geometric visual tools being helpful in depression therapy, and I thought maybe is similar, so I will try EMDR. I have reached significant progress diminishing stress around a many-decade-old fixation almost at once in a few days now. It is strange. Story 51, if you do someone a favor, you tend to like that person more as a result. Story 52, even after our minds have encoded memories, they can be subject to storage decay. However, after 4 days, the storage decay levels off, and you have a statistically reduced chance of forgetting any additional details, which means if you reinforce the information over those 4 days, it is likely to remain with you throughout your lifetime. Story 53, you can make a woman fall asleep by lifting her off the floor by her legs and rubbing her belly. I've tried it only on a ferret, but I see no reason why it shouldn't work on a woman. Story 54, the Benjamin Franklin effect, the concept that the most effective way to change someone's negative perception of you is simply to ask them to do a favor for you. This overwhelmingly causes a shift in their frame of reference in your regard to the more favorable. Story 55, Pavlov's dogs. His experiment was to ring a bell every time he presented food to the dogs. After some time, he found that only ringing the bell would cause the dogs to salivate. They had associated the food with the bell. Here is the detailed experiment. Story 56, that your brain cannot invent faces. So, if a random person you don't know in real life features prominently in one of your dreams, it's probably a person that you pass by on the street. and your brain just stored their face. Story 57, any defense mechanism. If you can understand a person's or your own defense mechanisms, actions and words can make so much more sense. Even if it isn't ideal, to understand why people do things can relieve so many problems, or at least really make sense of things. Story 58, not sure if this counts as psychology, but human memories are not as concrete as you may think if you provide 5 pictures to someone of their childhood. With one image being fake, such as photoshopping them into an amusement park, their brain will create artificial memories of the situation, which means that basically you would have memories of something occurring even though it never did. This works with over 45 of people. Story 59, when goalkeepers set up to save a penalty and they stand a few inches to their left, the shooter becomes far more likely to shoot to their right where there is a marginally bigger target. Story 60, asking somebody to borrow something they see as valuable, even something you have no use for, makes them think more highly of you. It makes them feel like you value their input. Story 61, Capgras syndrome. I work in a mental health field, and I've had patients suffer from this. It's when an individual believes someone they know has been replaced by an identical imposter. Basically, it's like The Sims and Fallout, but IRL. Story 62, your eye can be in perfect working order, but brain damage can cause you to believe you are blind, even though you can navigate obstacle courses while blind. On the other hand, your eyes can be totally non-functional, but a different type of brain damage will lead you to believe that your vision is perfect, and you'll subconsciously invent reasons for why you don't notice things. Story 63, I like reconstructive memory. The best way of describing this, I find, is if you think back to some of your earliest memories, picture them as clearly as possible, double-check if this memory is actually from your point of view. A lot of people will find most of these early memories to be from someone else's point of view. E.g., you are watching Baby You Crawl along the floor. I have a clear image of myself slipping on a slug in our back garden. In these memories, you're actually remembering someone else's memory. They have told you this memory, and your brain just takes it on as your own, never really questioning if you actually remember it or not. Hope I explained that well. Story 64, that if you think about your thoughts and truly observe them constantly, you'll find that you don't think about thinking your thoughts most of them, leaving the conclusion that if you aren't thinking your thoughts, then your thoughts must come from outside of you. In a Gnostic belief system, they believe that these thoughts come from the archons, architects of the universe, or what many polytheistic religions around the world refer to as their gods. Story 65, I once got in a massive argument that lasted a few months over whether or not we have more than 5 senses, my favorite of which is kinesthesia, which is the Buddhist ability to sense the orientation of parts of it in relation to itself. For example, close your eyes and touch your finger to your nose. Story 66, while I've done some reading online, and I read about this odd and automatic kind of a phenomenon that occurs when you read lines of text. Your brain is reading, and then you think you are registering all the words, but if you look even more closely at it, the entire paragraph, you'd notice that the last word in each sentence is also the first word of the following sentence. Story 67, not sure how legitimate it is, but I've read that gender is one of the more important factors with association in the mind. If you don't know someone's gender, it will continue to bother you until you know. Story 68, when you exercise, you release stress hormones. This causes a chain of events that lead to a person's body producing more and more euphoria, promoting neurotransmitters to counteract the stress effects. This is why the more cardio a person does, the faster they get runner's high. Exercise and a good diet fixes so many forms of psychopathology. Story 69, take something you absolutely hate about others. Congrats, you just found a shadowy part of your personality that you cannot accept, therefore you cannot integrate it. Story 70, the Dunning-Kruger effect, is a cognitive bias in which relatively unskilled persons suffer illusory superiority, mistakenly assessing their ability to be much higher than it really is. Dunning and Kruger attributed this bias to a metacognitive inability of the unskilled to recognize their own ineptitude and evaluate their own ability accurately. Their research also suggests corollaries highly skilled individuals may underestimate their relative competence and may erroneously assume that tasks which are easy for them are also easy for others. CV from Wikipedia. Story 71, the concept of identity being plot-able between commitment and choice. Forget the name of the psychologist, but basically our identity is sports. Religion can be measured in 4 distinct zones. For example, you follow a sports team your dad liked, high commitment, low choice. Story 72, a person's behavior after drinking is a function of personality and cultural perception of alcohol intoxication. A lot of people are ignorant of the latter or do not attach much credence to it. Some cultures and subcultures associate alcohol intoxication with being more open, forthcoming, flirty, etc., while some cultures associate with having a nice time talking with friends and family. Unfortunately, there are a lot of cultures around the world that also associate it with domestic violence. TLDR, how people behave or what they do after drinking depends on the kind of people they hung out with and the pop culture media they consumed growing up. Story 73, if you wear glasses that have lenses that invert everything so that it looks like it's upside down for long enough, eventually your brain will correct for this, and it will appear upside up again. Story 74, you can reprogram the mind to do whatever you wish it to do. If you grew up dealing with situations in a certain way, your mind is molded for that behavior. Coping mechanisms and behaviors are programs in the mind, certain configurations of neurons and certain parts of the brain being used more than others, produce things like personality and impulses, taking control of all behavior and stepping into a state of complete self-awareness. One can then choose the responses to both inner and external stimulus, which in effect gives the individual control over the mind's programming. When you react to something, you're programming your mind to react in the same way. When there is no reaction, there is no programming. Neuroplasticity is a scientific fact that our brains are programmable. They can be washed and unwashed. You can with effort become free of a great deal of affliction and cyclic suffering by learning how to break the mind's tendency for complacency, over-exaggeration, emotional clinging, and egotism. Emotional clinging and egotism are ways of thinking and processing information. The way you attach to things and the way you relate them to self have been programmed in through years of conditioning and results in a wide assortment of psychological afflictions. It all paints a picture of how much you suffer internally. Depression is the most dangerous disease on this planet, and for most, it's too touchy to talk about. But it's a huge problem in the world. I'm not saying suffering is illusory. What I am saying is the mind has been programmed to suffer, and so that's what you get, depression. Story 75, out of every 100 people who walk into a casino, 70 are able to, at some point, have more money than they began with. Of those, only 7 have the willpower to stop playing and walk out the door with their winnings. Story 76, the original and still current in the UK spelling of the word tidbit is titbit, but Americans are afraid that seeing the word written out will turn you into a raging. Story 77, the cross-race effect. There really is some scientific basis to it being harder to distinguish between people of a different race than your own. That is, to Asian people, Caucasians are harder to differentiate between than other Asians. Story 78, the just world hypothesis. Recognized that mechanism before I first read of it being a thing, but it explains a lot, especially when it comes to notions of society, politics, or history. Story 79, Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, based on the whole eat me, drink me fiasco from the book where Alice grows and shrinks, sufferers experience changes in object and body perspectives, seeing them as much bigger or smaller than normal. Visual hallucinations, often coupled with migraines, sometimes the result of taking hallucinogenic drugs. Story 80, I think that the most fascinating thing is the definition of the word normal. Psychology is, to my understanding, heavily invested in the study of the abnormal, with the DSM-5 being the most recent compilation of every abnormal state of mind out there. But the fascinating thing is that what is normal and what is abnormal are determined by society itself. More importantly, determined by the majority. So, say the majority shifts and now includes what was previously a minority, then the opinion of what is normal will change. We can see this happening in society by our new laws and ever-changing social standards. TLDR, any crime could be normal if we want it to be. Story 81, the Lake Wobegon effect. Human tendency is to describe oneself as above average in any number of traits, looks, driving abilities, etc. Of course, statistically we cannot all be above average, but when polled, more than half a population will respond that they are above average. The psychologist who coined the term was referring to a fictional town, Lake Wobegon, where everyone is attractive and excellent. Story 82, the backfire effect. The backfire effect occurs when, in the face of contradictory evidence, established beliefs do not change, but actually get stronger. The effect has been demonstrated experimentally in psychological tests, where subjects are given data that either reinforces or goes against their existing biases. And in most cases, people can be shown to increase their confidence in their prior position regardless of the evidence they were faced with. Story 83, how easy it is to implant false memories. A friend works on the psychology of memory, and there's an experiment they do where they pretend to be testing something else. The test subject does tasks on a computer and is told that the software is buggy, and if they press the Alt key, the computer will crash. Halfway through the test, the experimenter remotely causes the machine to crash from outside the room. Many, if not most, subjects will remember pressing the Alt key to make it crash, even though they definitely didn't. The computer has a keylogger installed, so they can check. Story 84. Projection and narcissism explain an uncomfortably large part of human behavior. We use ourselves as a model for others and also project our insecurities onto others. Leads to things like she keeps accusing you of cheating, so who's she sleeping with? Story 85. In a conversation and wondering if the other person is engaged listening. Lean yourself back, away from them. If the person is engaged in the conversation, they will automatically lean forward to compensate for the newly formed distance. Story 86. Token economy. When you get stickers for getting good grades or gold stars on a poster, it makes you feel good to have earned something. My pre-calc teacher does this with our notebooks, actually, and because we're taking psychology at the same time, we all talk about needing more tokens for our economy. Story 87. If you ask somebody their favorite food, movie, song, etc., they will usually be indecisive and be unable to answer. If you then ask them what their second favorite is, they will immediately and confidently answer. Story 88. Paradoxical undressing and terminal burrowing occur in the final stage of hypothermia. As a person is literally in the final moments of death from freezing, they take off their clothes. It's so bizarre. Story 89. I have an MSc in psychology and honestly can't think of anything that's especially interesting, possibly because it all seems so logical and normal after a while. One I quite liked, though it is already quite well known, is inattentional blindness. Look it up on YouTube if you don't know it yet. It's quite fun. Maybe watch this one first, then maybe this one for an experiment and some more explanation about change blindness, similarly interesting. I always think of these effects and why our brain works this way. When people get super angry at how selective people are and how much they care about certain dramatic events that happen around the world, we just can't process everything that happens, or would be overwhelmed. Our brain makes selections to protect us from overload. These experiments are only a tiny example of when and why that happens, but still. Story 90. DJVU, however the you spell it, is according to my psychology professor. Might be wrong or right, who knows? Your subconscious becoming aware of what is presently happening. Basically, information is being sent at such a high pace to your subconscious that it feels like you've already been donate hard whatever is happening. Still doesn't explain how I've been able to predict what friends are going to say when I have DJVU. Story 91. Split brain patients. The two halves of the brain are connected by what's called the corpus callosum, which is sometimes surgically severed for the treatment of some disorders. When this happens, you could get some interesting stuff that goes on because the brain is now essentially two separate brains that can't communicate very well. Sensory and motor control for each half of your body is wired to the opposite half of your brain, and the language processing center of your brain is usually on your left hemisphere. This means that if you were to show a patient an image in their left visual field, they would not be able to verbally explain to you what they had seen because their right brain cannot control speech function. They would, however, be able to draw it with their left hand, but not with their right. This can happen with any sort of sensory input that is limited to one side, such as feeling an object with one hand or hearing something in only one ear. If it's on the left, they will not be able to verbally describe anything about it. Hey, race a cool video about it. Story 92. Dissociative identity disorder, which was the entire premise of Fight Club. I just can't believe this is actually possible. It's really interesting to me. Story 93. Most of us will obey the commands of an authority, even if they conflict with our morals. Look at the Milgram experiment. In short, people administered shocks to other people when they didn't answer correctly in a quiz, even when those giving the shocks verbally objected to doing so. Story 94. The reason you sometimes grab a door and push it towards you, it's because our brains associate a handle with the action of pushing it towards you. If the door needs to be pushed opposite from you, it would be better if it didn't have a handle. Story 95. Not sure if it's exactly psychology, but occasionally when we experience a blind spot in our vision or are unable to see something clearly or properly, our brains will simply fill in the blank spot with whatever the most probable stimulus is, depending on the context of whatever is being viewed. It does this by using any and all information at its disposal, from surroundings and memory, to sort of jigsaw an image together to replace what would be just a black spot in our vision.